In the chilling aftermath of Edward II's reign, his death would not merely fade into the shadows of history, it would shape the very course of English politics for centuries to come. For a king whose failures were so deeply etched into the fabric of medieval England, his end had to be more than a mere footnote. It was a final calculated act, one designed to erase not just a king, but the very essence of his existence. His enemies, led by the vengeful Isabella and Mortimer, had been patient, waiting for the right moment to strip him of everything: his title, his dignity, and ultimately, his life. Edward II, once crowned with the hopes of a powerful kingdom, found himself a prisoner in his own domain. Betrayed by the very people who should have stood by him, abandoned by a wife who had once been a political ally, and outcast by his own nobles, Edward was reduced to a shadow of the man he once was. His failures in war, especially the devastating loss at Bannockburn, and his inability to control the very court that should have upheld his authority, left him vulnerable to the forces that would orchestrate his downfall. But what truly makes Edward's story one of the most haunting in English history is the manner in which his enemies chose to end him. Behind the stone walls of Berkeley Castle, his imprisonment was not just an act of political exile, it was a psychological war. The deprivation of his royal comforts, the constant reminders of his fall from grace, the harsh conditions meant to break his spirit, they were all part of the plan to erase not just his kingship, but his very humanity. Yet, as the pressure mounted and whispers of rescue began to stir, those in power decided that Edward's fate must be sealed in a manner that would not only destroy him physically, but symbolically. His death had to send a message, a warning to all who might challenge the new order. The method they allegedly used was as grotesque as it was symbolic: a hot iron rod, forced into his body through an agonizing and humiliating execution. A death so brutal, it left no visible marks yet scorched his very soul, reinforcing the societal norms and gender expectations of the time. For Edward, who had been seen as weak for his relationships with male favorites, the manner of his death was a direct reflection of what his enemies saw as his greatest sins. Sins that were considered an affront to the masculine royal ideal. The details of Edward's death, whether true or exaggerated, served a dual purpose. They were not only a political execution, but a form of spectacle, an art of power, humiliation, and revenge. It was a message sent not only to those who might seek to defy the throne, but to future generations, establishing the lengths to which power would go to maintain control. Edward's demise was not simply the end of one man. It was the obliteration of a legacy, the erasure of a king who had failed to meet the demands of the age. It was a moment that would forever alter the trajectory of English history, marking the brutal price of political failure. As the news of Edward's death spread like wildfire, it was met with a mix of relief, confusion, and suspicion. To the new regime, it was a necessary conclusion to their revolution, but to those who remembered the old king, it was a stark reminder of the fragile nature of power and the cost of crossing the line between political necessity and cruelty. In the end, the questions surrounding his death would be just as important as the death itself, for they reveal the deeper truths about power, loyalty, and the human cost of absolute rule. Whether Edward II's death was an act of calculated murder or a result of political manipulation, it remains a haunting lesson about the unforgiving nature of medieval authority. and the lengths to which people will go to maintain control. Edward II's reign, which began in 1307, was marked by a series of challenges that ultimately led to his downfall. As the fourth son of Edward I, known as Longshanks, Edward II ascended to the throne after his father's death. However, from the very beginning of his reign, it was evident that Edward was not cut from the same mold as his father. While Edward the Shah had been a successful warrior king, conquering Wales and fighting in Scotland, Edward II showed little interest in military affairs or the demanding duties of kingship. Edward's reign was marred by early signs of mismanagement and a lack of decisive leadership. One of his most controversial actions was his deep and personal relationship with Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight whom he elevated to the peerage and granted significant political power. This relationship enraged the English nobility, as Gaveston was seen as a foreigner who had no right to wield such influence. Edward's favoritism toward Gaveston alienated key nobles, creating tension in his court and undermining his authority. Many nobles viewed this as a breach of the established order, where the king was expected to balance his personal relationships with his duty to the realm. The situation worsened when Edward's military campaigns began to falter. His failure to effectively lead his forces in Scotland, particularly the catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, severely damaged his reputation. This battle, in which a much smaller Scottish army under Robert the Bruce routed the English forces, marked a turning point in Edward's reign. It exposed his inability to lead effectively, and by medieval standards, a king who could not win battles lost much of his mystique and divine right to rule. Edward's inability to address these military defeats and his reliance on unqualified favorites like Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser further weakened his position. His relationship with these men fueled the growing discontent among the English barons, who began to actively oppose his rule. This opposition culminated in the revolt of Thomas of Lancaster, Edward's cousin, and other powerful nobles who demanded that the king relinquish some of his royal authority. Adding to the instability was Edward's marriage to Isabella of France in 1308. Originally intended as a political alliance to strengthen relations between England and France, the marriage grew strained as Isabella increasingly became disillusioned with her husband's neglect of their marriage and his obvious preference for his male companions. Over time, Isabella's position became untenable, and her eventual betrayal of Edward by aligning with Roger Mortimer, an exiled noble, led to the downfall of Edward's reign. By the mid-1320s, the rebellion against Edward had gained significant momentum. Isabella and Mortimer's invasion of England in 1326 was swift, and within months, Edward's regime had collapsed. His nobles, weary of his failures, quickly switched allegiances, and Edward found himself alone, without support, and ultimately captured. The formal deposition of Edward II in 1327, one of the most dramatic acts of royal removal in English history, marked the end of his reign. Edward's inability to govern effectively, his reliance on unpopular favorites, and his failure to lead his armies to victory all contributed to his tragic downfall. His reign, rather than being defined by military conquest or political stability, was overshadowed by scandals, failures, and betrayal. The death of Piers Gaveston in 1312 marked a pivotal moment in Edward II's reign, sparking a political crisis that further weakened his authority and set the stage for the eventual collapse of his rule. Gaveston, a Gascon knight who had been Edward II's close companion and confidant, had been granted extensive power and titles, which deeply alienated the English nobility. His rise to prominence was seen by many as a direct challenge to the established order, as he was a foreigner and had little political or military experience. Edward's favoritism toward Gaveston enraged the nobles, who saw him as an outsider with undue influence over the king. In 1310, a group of powerful barons known as the Lords Ordainers attempted to curtail the king's authority by forcing him to agree to a series of reforms that would limit his ability to govern without consulting the nobility. These reforms were largely driven by the growing discontent with Gaveston's influence, which the barons believed was weakening the monarchy and undermining their power. Edward's refusal to part with Gaveston further deepened the rift between the king and his nobles. The conflict came to a head in 1312 when Gaveston was captured by the forces of the Earl of Lancaster, one of Edward's most powerful and vocal critics. After his capture, Gaveston was brought to Warwick Castle, where he was tried and executed by a group of nobles, many of whom were part of the opposition to Edward's rule. The manner of Gaveston's execution was brutal, as he was beheaded and his body was publicly displayed as a symbol of the nobles' power. The death of Gaveston had immediate and far-reaching consequences for Edward II. First, it exacerbated the political divide between the king and the barons, who now viewed Edward's refusal to control his favorites as a sign of weakness and poor judgment. The execution of Gaveston also created a sense of betrayal within Edward's inner circle, as he had been unable to protect his closest ally. This loss of trust further isolated the king from both his supporters and the nobility. The crisis sparked by Gaveston's death also highlighted Edward's inability to control his court and maintain the delicate balance of power between the monarchy and the nobility. The brutal execution marked the beginning of a series of political conflicts, with the barons increasingly challenging Edward's authority. Gaveston's death also fueled the growing opposition to the king's rule, particularly from the powerful nobles who felt sidelined by the king's favoritism and political decisions. Ultimately, the execution of Piers Gaveston was not just a personal tragedy for Edward II, but a political disaster that ignited a chain of events leading to his eventual downfall. The crisis of 1312 set the stage for further conflicts, including the rise of Isabella, Edward's queen, and Roger Mortimer, who would later play a significant role in Edward's deposition. The loss of Gaveston was a key turning point that exposed the deepening divisions within Edward's reign and paved the way for the political instability that would define the final years of his rule. Edward II's marriage to Isabella of France, which began in 1308, was initially seen as a political alliance aimed at strengthening ties between England and France. Isabella, the daughter of King Philip IV of France, was a highly intelligent, politically astute woman who was expected to be the perfect queen consort, helping to stabilize Edward's troubled reign. Together, they had 4 children, including Edward III, who would later become one of England's most successful kings. Despite these outward signs of a traditional and fruitful royal marriage, their relationship quickly deteriorated, leading to one of the most dramatic betrayals in English history. From the start, Isabella found herself neglected by her husband. Edward, who had inherited a kingdom full of challenges, was more interested in his personal relationships than in the responsibilities of kingship. His favoritism toward Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight, whom he raised to a position of great power, alienated both the English nobility and Isabella. The Queen, who had expected to play a significant role in her husband's court, found herself overshadowed by Gaveston, whose influence over Edward was both pervasive and controversial. This situation was humiliating for Isabella, who saw her political position undermined by the king's devotion to his male favorites. When Gaveston was executed by a group of nobles in 1312, Isabella, though initially supportive of her husband, found little solace in Edward's response. His failure to stand up to the barons and his inability to protect his closest ally left her feeling increasingly isolated. But the real turning point in Isabella's relationship with Edward came when the king's favor shifted to another of his male companions, Hugh Despenser the Younger, and his father, Hugh Despenser the Elder. The Despensers, like Gaveston, wielded enormous influence at court, and they soon became even more despised than Gaveston had been. Isabella's resentment grew as she watched her husband lavish attention and resources on the Despensers while neglecting their marriage and her role as queen. Edward's refusal to control the Despensers, who grew wealthier and more powerful at the expense of the nobility, became a source of mounting tension. The Queen's political position, already fragile, began to disintegrate under the weight of her husband's neglect and the growing opposition to the Despensers' rule. As the years passed, Isabella's discontent with her husband deepened. In the mid-1320s, she was sent on a diplomatic mission to France to negotiate peace between England and France. During her time in France, she found herself increasingly drawn to Roger Mortimer, a former English baron who had been imprisoned by Edward the Sand but had escaped to France. Mortimer, like Isabella, had reasons to seek revenge on Edward. He had been a vocal critic of the king's reign and had been imprisoned during the early years of Edward's rule. Mortimer and Isabella formed both a personal and political alliance, united by a shared desire to remove Edward from the throne. Their relationship quickly turned into an affair, and by 1376, Isabella had become fully committed to Mortimer's cause. They began plotting to invade England, gathering support from disaffected English nobles and preparing for a full-scale rebellion. This alliance, while born out of personal betrayal, was also motivated by Isabella's political ambitions and her desire to restore her dignity and power as queen. The invasion, which took place in late 1326, was swift and decisive. Isabella and Mortimer landed in Suffolk with a small force, but Edward's regime collapsed almost immediately. Isabella, now leading a revolution against her own husband, was able to rally support from the nobility, many of whom were disillusioned with Edward's rule. Edward, who had lost the loyalty of his nobles and the support of his queen, was left with little recourse. He fled westward, hoping to escape to Wales or Ireland, but was captured in November 1326. Edward's capture marked the end of his reign, and Isabella and Mortimer took control of the throne, ruling in the name of Edward III, Isabella's young son. Edward II was formally deposed in January 1327, a move that set a dangerous precedent for the English monarchy. While the political betrayal was complete, the personal betrayal Isabella had suffered throughout her marriage was equally significant. The story of her affair with Mortimer and the subsequent coup was one of the most dramatic acts of royal betrayal in English history, changing the course of the monarchy forever. Isabella's role in Edward II's downfall was both personal and political. While her betrayal was motivated by personal neglect and humiliation, it also had profound political consequences. The Queen, once a pawn in a royal marriage, became the mastermind behind the overthrow of her husband. However, this betrayal was not without its consequences. Isabella, after securing power, would eventually find herself deposed by her son, Edward III, who had learned valuable lessons from his father's tragic end. The coup that led to the deposition of Edward II was a dramatic and unprecedented event in English history. The seeds of the rebellion had been planted long before, as Edward's reign had been characterized by political instability, military failures, and the growing resentment of both his nobility and his wife, Isabella of France. The coup itself, however, was the result of a delicate alliance between Isabella and Roger Mortimer, who had their own personal and political reasons for seeking to overthrow the king. In the mid-1320s, Isabella, once Edward II's neglected queen, found herself in a precarious position. Her marriage was increasingly strained due to Edward's preference for his male favorites, particularly the Despensers, and his neglect of her political role. Isabella's relationship with Mortimer, who had escaped imprisonment in England and was living in exile in France, became the catalyst for a political revolution. Mortimer, who had long been a critic of Edward's misrule and had personal grievances with the king, saw in Isabella the perfect partner for his plans to reclaim his lost power and remove Edward from the throne. Their relationship, both personal and political, was a turning point. Together, they began to gather support from disgruntled English nobles who were dissatisfied with Edward's rule. Many of these nobles had been alienated by the king's reliance on the Despensers and his inability to restore stability after military defeats, such as the catastrophic loss at Bannockburn. The king's weakening authority, combined with Isabella's growing dissatisfaction, made the time ripe for action. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer launched a swift and well-coordinated invasion of England. They landed in Suffolk with a small force, but their cause quickly gained traction as many English nobles, disillusioned with Edward's reign, rallied to their side. The Despensers were quickly captured and executed, and Edward, realizing that his regime had collapsed, fled westward, hoping to escape to Wales or Ireland. However, he was captured near the Welsh border in November 1326, marking the end of his rule. The formal deposition of Edward II came in January 1327, and the process was as much political theater as it was a legal act. The new government, led by Isabella and Mortimer, sought to make the deposition appear legitimate, despite the fact that it was essentially a palace coup. Parliament was convened to formally remove Edward from the throne, but the decision was far from free. The political forces behind the deposition, including Mortimer's supporters, controlled the capital, and Edward was presented with a stark choice: either renounce the throne or face further consequences. Edward's abdication was a humiliating moment, one recorded by contemporary chroniclers who described him as weeping as he agreed to surrender his crown to his son, Edward III, who was still a minor. Whether Edward truly abdicated willingly or under duress is still debated, but it is clear that he had no choice. The political pressure, combined with his isolation and lack of support, left him with little recourse. This marked a significant moment in English history, as it was the first time a king had been formally deposed while still alive. However, the deposition of Edward II was not the end of the story. Once Edward had been deposed, the question of what to do with him remained. Simply letting him go would have left him as a potential rallying point for those loyal to the old regime. So Isabella and Mortimer decided to imprison him in Berkeley Castle, far from the eyes of the public. The conditions of his imprisonment were harsh, and there were growing rumors that the king's death would soon be ordered to prevent any chance of his return. Despite being deposed, Edward's death did not happen immediately, and his imprisonment at Berkeley Castle set the stage for a brutal and politically motivated end. The official story of Edward II's death, though, was shrouded in mystery and suspicion, with many believing that his death was not natural, but the result of deliberate action by those who feared his return to power. Isabella and Mortimer's ruthless determination to eliminate Edward from the political equation once and for all would eventually come to pass, marking the tragic end to one of England's most tumultuous reigns. The coup that deposed Edward II and the subsequent events marked a significant turning point in English monarchy, as it set a dangerous precedent for the deposition of kings and the role of Parliament in matters of royal succession. Edward's downfall would shape the course of English politics for generations to come, especially when his son, Edward III, eventually asserted his authority and restored the monarchy's strength. After his deposition in January 1327, Edward II was moved to Berkeley Castle, a remote fortress in Gloucestershire, under the control of Thomas de Berkeley, a baron who had personal reasons to dislike the former king. The decision to imprison Edward at Berkeley was part of a careful political calculation by Isabella and Mortimer. They feared that as long as Edward lived, he could remain a symbol of resistance to their rule and potentially rally support from loyalists who still viewed him as the legitimate monarch. Edward's imprisonment at Berkeley Castle was marked by harsh conditions designed to break his spirit and undermine his health. The castle was chosen not only for its isolation, but also for its fortifications, which made any escape attempt unlikely. Edward was confined in a small, uncomfortable cell with poor food, inadequate bedding, and a lack of proper medical care. These conditions were meant to humiliate him and keep him in a state of physical and mental torment. The psychological warfare was as significant as the physical deprivation, as Edward was constantly reminded of his fall from power and the loss of his royal dignity. The isolation was intended to diminish any hope of rescue, as the castle was far from the political centers of England. Over the following months, rumors circulated about the growing distress of the former king. He was effectively cut off from the world, completely dependent on his captors. The squalid conditions and deliberate mistreatment were a form of psychological punishment, a constant reminder of how far he had fallen from his former glory as King of England. By the summer of 1327, political pressures were mounting for a more permanent solution to the problem of Edward II. Foreign courts, particularly in France and the Holy Roman Empire, began to ask uncomfortable questions about the former king's treatment. There were even rumors that rescue attempts were being planned. Isabella and Mortimer could not afford to let Edward live any longer, as his continued existence posed a threat to their fragile grip on power. The decision was made to eliminate him entirely, but they had to ensure that his death appeared natural, to avoid sparking a rebellion or drawing attention to the brutal reality of their actions. It is widely believed that Edward was murdered in September 1327, though the exact details of his death remain shrouded in mystery. The most commonly reported version of his death involves a method of execution so horrific and symbolic that it would send a powerful message. According to some accounts, Edward was killed by a red-hot poker, which was allegedly inserted into his body through his rectum, burning his internal organs and causing a slow, agonizing death. The act left no external marks of violence, allowing Isabella and Mortimer to claim that Edward died of natural causes, either from grief or illness, while ensuring that his death was painful and humiliating. The use of such a gruesome method of execution, if true, was deeply symbolic. Edward's relationship with his male favorites, particularly Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser, had scandalized medieval society, and his perceived failure to meet the masculine ideals of kingship and power was seen as a major reason for his downfall. His death, allegedly carried out in such a way, was a grotesque reflection of the medieval belief in symbolic justice. It was a message to all who might challenge the new order, showing that those who failed to embody the ideals of royal masculinity and authority would face not only the loss of power, but also a brutal, degrading end. The official story of Edward's death was immediately followed by a carefully orchestrated cover-up. His body was quickly prepared for a public funeral, and the official cause of death was declared to be natural, likely brought on by grief and his harsh treatment. Edward's body was displayed to the public, and the details of his brutal murder were carefully suppressed. The conspiracy surrounding his death was so effective that for many years the full truth was obscured. However, the rumors about Edward's death never fully disappeared, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding it cast a long shadow over Isabella and Mortimer's rule. Within months of Edward's death, several individuals involved in his imprisonment or who might have known the truth about his demise died under mysterious circumstances, suggesting that anyone with knowledge of the events was being silenced. The death of Edward II marked the final tragic chapter of a king who had been deposed by his wife and former allies. His passing, whether as a result of murder or natural causes, was not just the end of his life. It was the destruction of his legacy and the elimination of any hope of his return to power. The repercussions of his death would resonate throughout England, shaping the reign of his son, Edward III, and altering the course of English history. The death of Edward II is one of the most brutal and symbolic in English history, reflecting not only the political consequences of his downfall, but also the deeply ingrained medieval ideals of kingship, masculinity, and justice. The method by which he allegedly died and the symbolic nature of his execution continues to haunt the annals of history, raising questions about the extent to which political opponents can go to eliminate a threat, and the lengths to which revenge can be taken in the medieval world. The alleged method of execution. The most widely accepted, yet still debated version of Edward II's death involves a horrific method of execution designed to leave no visible marks of violence, while ensuring that the king's death was slow, agonizing, and deeply humiliating. According to various chroniclers and accounts, Edward was murdered by a red-hot poker, which was allegedly inserted into his body through his rectum, burning his internal organs. This method, both grotesque and symbolic, caused Edward to die in excruciating pain. It also allowed his captors to claim that he had died of natural causes, possibly from illness or grief over the fall from power, without leaving any external signs of physical violence. The choice of such a method, while horrifically effective, was deeply symbolic. It served to punish Edward for what his enemies saw as his greatest sins, the perceived sexual transgressions involving his relationships with male favorites, particularly Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser. In medieval society, where notions of masculinity were intrinsically linked to authority, leadership, and the ability to control one's kingdom, Edward's relationships were seen as an affront to the traditional ideals of kingship. His failure to meet these expectations, as well as his perceived weakness as a leader, made him a target of those who saw his reign as a threat to the stability of the realm. The brutal method of his execution was not just a form of punishment, but a direct reflection of these perceived transgressions. Symbolism of Edward's death. The method of Edward's death, whether fact or exaggerated myth, was imbued with a powerful symbolism that sent a clear message to those who might challenge the new regime. The insertion of a red-hot poker, an act designed to cause pain and internal damage while leaving no trace on the surface of his body, was a visual and psychological act. It symbolized the erasure of Edward as a king and a man, removing him not only from power, but from the world of kingship and authority that was so vital in medieval times. This act of execution was not just about eliminating a political rival. It was a way to humiliate him for his failures in adhering to the expected norms of kingship. The absence of visible wounds and the claim of a natural death were calculated to maintain plausible deniability, allowing those in power, Isabella and Mortimer, to avoid the direct blame for murder, while ensuring that Edward's death served as a public statement of their control over the monarchy. By making the cause of death seem ambiguous, they could justify his removal while avoiding the scandal of regicide. The symbolism extended beyond the method itself. It was not just about ending a life, but about the consequences of violating the social and royal norms of the time. Edward's reign had been marked by his devotion to his favorites, his failure in military leadership, and his inability to embody the traditionally masculine qualities expected of a king. His death was thus not just a political act, it was a symbolic representation of the price of those failures, a public execution of what Edward II had come to represent in the eyes of his enemies: weakness, failure, and dishonor. The legacy of Edward II's death. Edward's death, whether the details were embellished or not, remains a powerful example of the ways in which political enemies could use symbolic violence to send a message. His brutal end was an attempt to erase not just his life, but the idea of him as a king. The humiliation of his death would have been felt not only by Edward, but also by the people who had supported him, as well as by future monarchs who understood the danger of being perceived as weak or unfit to rule. The symbolic nature of Edward II's execution also played a crucial role in the way his death was remembered. The act of removing a king in such a brutal and degrading manner sent a clear signal to future rulers about the high stakes of royal authority. It also established a precedent for the brutal methods that would be employed in future English royal conflicts, particularly during times of political crisis. Edward's death was a turning point, one that altered the trajectory of English monarchy and governance. It marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, as his son, Edward III, learned from the mistakes of his father. For Isabella and Mortimer, the removal of Edward II had solidified their grip on power, but it also led to their own downfall, as the ruthlessness with which they eliminated their former king was seen as a dangerous precedent, one that would eventually be used against them. In the end, the death of Edward II is a chilling reminder of the power of symbolism in politics and the extreme lengths to which individuals in power will go to protect their rule, erase their enemies, and maintain the status quo. Whether or not the brutal details of his execution are entirely true, they serve as a powerful metaphor for the destructive power of political betrayal, revenge, and the collapse of a king's legacy.